All right, let's continue our solving equations review. We're going to focus today on multiplication equations. Just a quick little review, nothing to write down, just listen. In our steps that we followed to solve our equations, step 4 was undoing multiplication. So I just want a quick review what that step entails before we start practicing. So to undo our multiplication, we need to make what we're eliminating become 1. Okay, so the goal is to make the number we're eliminating become 1. Now, a way that you can think about this without having to, memorize a bunch of different steps is remembering what a reciprocal is. So we can eliminate by using a reciprocal. And we're going to look at exactly what that looks like in just a minute. So let's review some vocabulary. The reciprocal. Probably recognize the word. See if you remember what it is. The reciprocal is also known as the multiplicative inverse. It's a pair of numbers that, when multiplied, equal 1. Okay, so the multiplicative inverse comes in when we're looking at using the reciprocal to solve our equations. Here's what we mean by a pair of numbers that, when multiplied, equal 1. Oops. Sorry about that. Okay, here's an example. Usually with reciprocals, you start out with fractions. It doesn't have to be, but for example, 4/5. Well, the reciprocal is a number that, when I multiply it by 4/5, it equals 1. So the goal is to get 1. Now, this reciprocal that I'm going to look for, actually, some teachers will say the fraction flipped. The numerator and the denominator switch positions. Because what will happen is when I take a number and multiply it by the reciprocal, I can cross simplify my 4s and my 5s, and I end up with 1/1. Or if I were to multiply my numerators and my denominators, I get 20/20, which is 1. If I had a whole number and I need the reciprocal, what times 3 will equal 1? Think about that for a second. What times 3 equals 1? How about 1/3? Remember, the numerator and the denominator switch positions. So if I don't see a denominator here, it's actually a 1, right? So the reciprocal of 3 is 1/3. And when I multiply, I get 3/3, which does equal 1. So reciprocal is going to be something important that we remember because we're going to use it a lot when we're solving these multiplication equations. So remember, when we get to solving a multiplication equation, the goal is that the number we want to eliminate has to become 1. Okay, and we'll see why here in a second. Okay, example 1. Now again, we are going to go through those 5 long steps to solve our equations. And honestly, most of the steps we will not really have to do anything. But again, while these problems are easy, I want to practice the steps, get you used to the steps, so that when we actually need all the steps, we know them. So step 1 is to simplify. I don't have any subtraction to deal with. I don't have distributing, combining like terms. Everything is simplified. So step 2, remembering our goal. My goal is to end up with C equals some number, right? So step 3, undo any addition that we have. I don't have any addition to undo. It's done with step 3. Now we're up to step 4. Step 4 says, undo multiplication. And it says that the number that we need to eliminate has to become 1. Remember, we want variable on one side, numbers on the other. So the number that needs to get eliminated is this guy right here, this 6. The 6 is a problem. This 6 has to become 1 because, write this a little bit differently. This 6 has to become 1 because 1c equals c. Remember the identity property? 1 times any number is itself. So our goal is to eliminate this 6 by making it become 1. Okay. Now this is where things get a little bit to the point where you can make a decision. First thing, what you've probably learned is 6 is being multiplied by c. So to undo multiplication, we divide. Totally true. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with learning that you divide by 6 because we're undoing the multiplication of 6. Perfect. And if we look at this, 6 divided by 6 is 1, right? Or if you look at the fraction, 6 over 6 eliminates and becomes 1, which is exactly what we want. Negative 12 over 6 becomes negative 2. Beautiful. Now, you don't have to write this part down, but I want you to think about this for a second. If I looked at 6 as a fraction, 6 over 1, and I wanted you to remember that the step for multiplication was multiply both sides by the reciprocal. So just go with me on this for a second. If you want to copy this down, you can. So I'm going to find the reciprocal of 6 over 1, which is 1 over 6. And I'm going to multiply that on both sides, because remember, whatever I do to one side, I do to the other. Now, 6 times 1 over 6 times 1 actually becomes 1c like we want. If I look at this as a fraction, I get negative 12 over 6, which is actually the same thing I got my first way. And that leaves me with negative 2. Now, we do know we don't need the 1 there for the answer. I get the same answer. 2 different methods. Now, this is where you have to make a little bit of a decision, because in these type of equations, you can either have 3 different methods or 1 method. Okay, so you can have 3 different methods or 1 method. If you choose to think about solving your equation by using reciprocals, you will have 1 method to remember. If you want to say, if you multiply 6, I need to undo it by dividing 6, you're going to have 3 different methods for 1 type of equation. Keep that in mind. And actually, now that I think about it, I do want you to copy these 2 methods down. Okay. Oops. So take a second and copy this down. So if you like the method on the left, you're dividing each side by the coefficient. If you like the method on the right, we multiply by the reciprocal of the coefficient. This is a C. Coefficient. Let's try that again. And we'll come back through and look at these in a second. Example number 2, x over 2 equals negative 16. Now we're going to take a look at this 2 different ways again. The first method is probably what you learned in 7th grade. X is being divided by 2. Now if you're dividing by 2, to undo that, we would multiply both sides by 2. So multiply both sides by the denominator. Because remember, step 1, we don't need to simplify anything. Step 2, remember our goal. Our goal is to get x equals some number. 3, undo addition. There is none. Step 4, undo multiplication. Now you might be looking at this and going, it's not multiplication, it's division. But give me a second and we'll take a look at that. So now with multiplication equations, we're now on a second method you have to remember. Okay, remember our first method was if you multiply by a number, you divide by that number. Our next method is, well, if you're dividing by 2, you multiply both sides by 2. Perfect, let's do that. Times 2, because remember, if I multiply my fractions here, I end up with 2x over 2. My 2's cancel, and I'm left with 1x, right? So by multiplying by this denominator, I actually end up eliminating my 2's on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, I multiply and get negative 32. And I don't need the 1 there. Of course, I left out step 5 to check it. Negative 32 over 2. Does it equal negative 16? Negative 32 divided by 2 is negative 16. So it checks. Now let's look at the method that I describe in the steps. I say to undo multiplication, you multiply both sides by the reciprocal. So let's take a look at our equation here for a second. Now you might be saying the reciprocal, like 2 over x. No, we're not dividing by the x. The x, remember, that's why step 2 is there. Think of your goal. My goal is x equals a number. So I don't want to do anything to this x. I like where that's at. I don't want to mess with it. But what numbers is my coefficient here that you just don't see? It's a 1, right? So technically what I have here is I have 1/2 times x. What's the reciprocal of 1/2? 2 over 1. There's nothing different from the left side to the right side. It's just the way that I'm looking at the numbers. So I'm looking at the numbers as a fraction so that I can multiply the reciprocal on both sides. Again, up to you. I would prefer this same method because now I have my addition method, I have the first multiplication method, I have the second example number 2's method. That's a lot to remember because when I look at what's happening on my same old method on the right, I get the same thing. My 2's cancel. I get 1x equals negative 32. Again, you might be thinking, well, I've always done it like on the left. I'm okay. All right, that's cool. What happens when you see this? Three over 4r. I'm going to show you my method first, and then I'm going to show you what I see most students do that decide they want another method. So my same method, we'll call it Miss A's method, I don't know. It's literally undo multiplication by multiplying by the reciprocal. Okay, let's think about that again. Undo multiplication by multiplying by the reciprocal. That's an inverse operation. So let's look at this. I need, remember, step 1, simplify, don't have it. Step 2, think of the goal. My goal is to get r equals some number. So that means r has to stay, 3/4 has to go. Undo multiplication by multiplying by the reciprocal. Well, the reciprocal of 3/4 is 4/3. My 3's cancel, my 4's cancel, I left with r. This take a little bit of a second. I could cross simplify, or I can just get 24/3, which simplifies to 8. If I check it, I get 3/4 times 8 equals 6. That becomes 24/4. 24 divided by 4 is 6, and that's correct. Now, you might be looking at this going, well, yeah, your method is what I normally would have done. And that's great. But think about that for a second. You have one method for when you're multiplying a number, another method for when you're dividing a number, and then another method for when you have a fraction. That's 3 methods for a simple one-step equation. That's crazy. Why not just solve all of these by using a reciprocal? That's silly. One thing to remember. Whether you're multiplying, dividing, have a fraction, figure out the reciprocal of the number, and you're done. Okay. Now, I've seen all different kinds of things on the left-hand side. Don't copy any of this down, though. I've seen people say, well, I'm going to divide everything by 3. That's nice because you can't divide a fraction by 3. It's already been divided. You can't divide division. You can, but the amount of work you're about to do is insane. So some people will say, well, I don't know what to do then. I'm totally confused. I have no clue. And they're done. Crazy. Other people might say, well, I'm going to multiply by 4. Those cancel, and I get 3r equals 24. Then I'll divide by 3 and get r equals 8. That's okay if you'd like to do extra work. But think about what you did here. I multiplied by 4 and then I divided by 3, which is nothing different than multiplying by 4/3. The exact same thing. Less work. Crazy. No, bad. Reciprocal is the one that makes the most sense for this type of equation, and that's usually what students learn. What I want to push you to do is use that reciprocal method for every multiplication equation. So the next couple examples, that's exactly what we're going to do. So this is technically example 4. So again, we're going to use my reciprocal method to solve all of these so that you don't have to remember 3 different things. Now again, if you've memorized them, it's your goal in life to have those 3 methods forever and ever. More power to you. I don't want to remember that much. So let's look at it like this. This is a fraction. Well, okay, simplifying. We have no simplifying to do. Step 2, remember our goal. Our goal is to get my variable by itself. So I want the w, get rid of the 11. Step 3, I have no addition to undo. So step 4 is the multiplication to undo. To undo multiplication, multiply by the reciprocal. If I force 11 to become a fraction, so again, if I force 11 to become a fraction, the reciprocal of 11/1 is 1/11. My 11's cancel. I'm left with W. On the left-hand side, I've got 44 over 11. So I end up with W equals 4. Check it out. 44 equals 11 times. Remember, I'm substituting a 4 for the W. 11 times 4 is 44, and that checks. And again, yes, I know dividing by 11 looks exactly the same, but it's something else to remember. Let's look at this example. Call this number 5. Remember step 1, simplify. Nothing to simplify. Step 2, remember our goal. I want A by itself. I've got to get A. Step 3, undo addition. I have none. Step 4, undo multiplication. Undo multiplication by multiplying by the reciprocal. Remember, we don't want to get rid of the A. But what you need to remember is when I'm looking for the reciprocal, I can't forget that I have a 1 in the numerator. So really my fraction is negative 1/3. Well, the reciprocal of 1/3 is 3 over 1. The reciprocal of negative 1/3 is negative 3 over 1. Let me make this look a little better. Okay. Remember, if I want to get just A and I have a negative number here, I've got to multiply by a negative to cancel that out. Remember, a negative times a negative is positive. So my 3's cancel. My negative times negative is positive, and that leaves me with 1A, right? Since I multiplied the left side by negative 3 over 1, I'm going to multiply the right side by negative 3 over 1. When I multiply, I get negative 30 over 1, so my final answer is A equals negative 30. Again, identify the number, make it identify the fraction, make it a fraction if it isn't already one. Multiply both sides by the reciprocal. Piece of cake. To check it, I have negative. Here's where we get tricky. Negative 30 over 3 equals 10. Or does it? Now, negative times negative is a positive, right? These are going to undo each other. If you think about a negative as the opposite, negative 3 means the opposite of 3, right? So I can look at this as the opposite of negative 30. It's positive 30. Or I can look at that as a negative times a negative. So this ends up becoming Let me back up, hold on. Oops, sorry. This ends up becoming 30 over 3. Remember, because these two are going to cancel each other out. Does it equal 10? Well, 30 over 3 does equal 10. All right, last example, number 6. 2/3 y equals negative 3. So again, number 1, we simplify. There's nothing to simplify. Step 2, remember our goal. My goal is to have y equals some number, which means I need to eliminate the 2/3. This is a problem. Okay, Step 3 is to undo addition. I don't have any. Step 4, undo multiplication by multiplying by the reciprocal. The reciprocal of 2/3 is 3 over 2. So I end up with, those cancel. I get 1y equals, let's create a fraction here so I can multiply, negative 9 over 2. Which, as long as you simplify the answer, I don't mind if it's improper. Not a big deal. Check. 2/3 times -9/2. Does it equal -3? When I multiply, I get -18/6, which equals -3. And we're good. So again, if you have the different methods memorized, and you remember that if you're multiplying, you divide, if you're dividing, you multiply, and if you have a fraction, you use the reciprocal, more power to you. I would prefer you to have one method to deal with these type of equations. Multiply by the reciprocal. That's it. That's all.